Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at yet another X470 motherboard, this time from Gigabyte, the Ultra Gaming, and I can assure you there is nothing Ultra about this board. Now, before we get into what has me so disappointed, well, not disappointed, let's go over some of the things that are like slight positives for this motherboard. So it has dual BIOS, as like every Gigabyte motherboard has. It has dual BIOS. It's the software dual BIOS implementation, which even Gigabyte knows is kind of buggy and glitchy at the best of times, which is why on the X470 Gaming 7 there's a switch to disable the dual BIOS, the software dual BIOS mode, and then another switch to manually switch between which BIOS chip you're on. This board isn't expensive enough to warrant actually having having those functions, so you're stuck with the software dual BIOS mode. However, most of the time it should recover you. The main issues with it is it sometimes gets in the way of overclocking. Like if you set up an unstable memory overclock, it'll sometimes just randomly decide to wipe your BIOS, like not wipe your BIOS, like literally restore the BIOS from the backup one, which gets kind of annoying because it completely wipes all your settings when it does that. Sometimes it will fail to restore the BIOS when you, like, say, mess up a BIOS flash. Sometimes that won't work, but that's kind of rare. And yeah, so, you know, it's a bit glitchy and buggy, but most of the time it works okay. But I'd much prefer if they just dropped the software and gave us a switch. Like, honestly, just a straight-up BIOS switch, in my opinion, is a much better way of dealing with dual BIOS than the software implementation. Also, on some motherboards, like on one of the more recent boards I've used from Gigabyte, it seems like the dual BIOS implementation randomly switches which BIOS chip you're on. So like your profiles come and go, which is really annoying. So yeah, a switch would be, in my opinion, better, you know, a lot better. Like they could throw the software implementation out the window, put a freaking switch on the board. Or a jumper. You know, if a switch is too damn expensive, just put a freaking jumper, because the software, at the best of times, it's a bit obnoxious. So, and then at the worst of times, it just completely fails to work. So, yeah, but at least you do have dual BIOS, because a lot of other motherboards, like, instead of have a questionable backup system, you have no backup system. Like, you screw up your BIOS flash, and that's it. The board's bricked. So, you know, unless you have like a hardware flasher for BIOSes, but yeah, so that's a slight positive. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And down here you have very blurry, because of my picture quality, 4 troubleshooting LEDs, and there's a clear CMOS jumper right there. So the 4 troubleshooting LEDs indicate if you're, well, basically if you're booting up, it'll tell you if the CPU, RAM, boot device, or what was the last one? GPU are causing boot issues. Not as good as a postcode, but most of the time this is more than, like, most of the time this is enough to tell you what it is that you need to do. The postcode is obviously better because it gives you more details, but as a bare minimum, this is acceptable in my opinion. Not having this is, in my opinion, is a problem. Okay, a lot of boards that they don't have this at all, and then that would be an issue. But here you have the bare minimum for debug. So that's nice. And before we get to the VRM, Gigabyte has addressed one of my complaints for the X370 boards, for the cheaper X370 boards they made. They've upgraded the heatsinks! Yay! So this thing is significantly heavier than the X370 heatsink. It is significantly, what else? It's heavier. It seems to have more surface area, and that's basically it. So, you know, it should take longer to overheat, and it should probably maintain lower temperatures. That's the VCore one right there. And then the SOC heatsink is this one. And unfortunately, this heatsink was deemed far too functional, so they decided to put a little, you know, plate of aluminum, like glue on a plate of aluminum onto it. Because, you know, there's a bunch of fins up top that, you know, it'd be really unfortunate if those actually got any airflow. So you have to cover them up. Otherwise, the board doesn't look pretty enough. So yeah, but the VCore VRM heatsink has gotten a significant upgrade. The SOC one, it seems to be, it's still heavier, and it does have more surface area. It's just I'm not sure how all of the surface area covered up by that top plate, how functional it's going to be. So yeah, But that's the heatsink situation. Now let's get on to the VRM. Now the VRM on this thing is exactly the same VRM you would get on the X470 Gaming 5. So, yeah, that's bad. And Gigabyte advertises this thing right here as an 8+3 phase, which I can assure you it is not, because this chip right here is an ISL 95712, which is the same chip they used on the X370 boards, if I remember correctly. And this thing is a 4+3 phase with integrated gate drive. There is no way to double off of this thing. Actually, no, it's not no way. If you were insane, you could probably make a very expensive doubling system that works with this. But generally speaking, this doesn't double at all. And this motherboard doesn't have doubling either. So basically what you're stuck with is this being your SOC VRM, and your V-core is a 4-phase trying very hard to look like an 8-phase, right? Because basically your VRM is going to you're going to have these two MOSFETs turn on at the same time, and then these two, and these two, and these two, and these two, and these two, because this is a 4-phase. Because you have one driver, and it's not like a dual driver where it can drive 2 phases and interleave them. No, this is just a straight up single-phase driver, and it just drives 2 sets of MOSFETs and 2 sets of inductors and 2 inductors at the same time. So this is a 4-phase, even though it really does look like it looks like an 8. It's a 4, and that's I skipped 5, didn't I? It's funny. Yeah. So it's a 4-phase because you get 1, 2, 3, 4 like that. And this is fine because most of the low-end motherboards do something like this. So I'm not going to complain about the phase count here, but the fact that they're marketing it as an 8-phase is just straight up lies, because this isn't, this doesn't even interleave. These phases turn on at this, this whole thing turns on at the same time. So not an 8-phase, because you have 4 PWM signals being interleaved, not 8. Or not even 4 that are split, getting doubled up properly. So it is a 4-phase. The SOC VRM is a 3, so they're not lying about that part, since it's split up kind of like that. And yeah, so that's the phase count situation, which is fine. Most low-end boards, like the MSI Gaming Plus that I looked at, that was a 4+2. I think Asus is running mostly 4+2s. What else is there? ASRock, I think, is doing the same thing where they're doing a 4+3 or a 4+2. I'm not sure right now. I've not looked at any ASRock boards. Well, not in detail. So basically, all of the boards at this board's price range, they're all 4-phase boards. All of them. None of them have an actual 8-phase. And that's, it's normal, because even on, high-end motherboards, we're talking $200 plus, you won't get a VRM that's a real 8-phase most of the time. Real 8-phase VRMs are extremely rare for motherboards. There's quite a few GPUs that actually have real 8-phase VRMs, but motherboards, generally, you're looking at a fake. Either through a 4-phase that is getting doubled, which I would accept as a 8-phase, and then you have this thing, which isn't an 8-phase at all. This is a 4. So, yeah, now there are some benefits to doing this. It basically spreads your thermal load. It slightly improves VRM efficiency. Well, it improves VRM efficiency quite significantly, because if you had half the MOSFETs, your low-side power losses would get pretty ridiculous pretty quick. But, this is definitely not, so thermally it has some benefits, and efficiency-wise it has some benefits. As far as actual voltage regulation goes, this is a 4-phase. So that's kind of that sorted. Now then, let's talk about the MOSFETs. The high side MOSFET is a Gigabyte favorite 4C10N, and it sucks. Okay, no, it doesn't. This is a really common MOSFET for low-end stuff. Okay? Low-end being the key word. And the low-side MOSFET is a 4C06. So this is the exact same MOSFET, and both of these are made by On Semiconductor, which is a name brand MOSFET manufacturer. They own Fairchild more recently. On Semi is capable of producing perfectly good MOSFETs, but these are the budget option. and they're not good. So yeah, it's like, and basically what you need to know is the 4C10N is like 7 milliohm RDS on high side, which is fine. Like, you don't need a super low RDS on the high side, but the low side is a 4 milliohm MOSFET, which is awful. Like, that is just straight up awful. For comparison, the MSI X470 Gaming Plus uses a 2.8 milliohm, right? Like, that's a pretty significant difference. You know, because this resistance right here has most of the power, like most of the heat that a VRM produces is from the RDS on of the low side MOSFET. Just for fun, I basically went and just messed with the calculation, and just you know, just for fun, I replaced the RDS on with like 2 milliohms, and suddenly this VRM was a lot less garbage. But, you know, Gigabyte opted for 4C06s, so that's what we're going to go with. So, power capabilities. Well, for a 27... What the hell is GIMP doing? Is it screwed up about... Oh, yeah, it got screwed up about the mouse. So, for 10 volts gate drive, because if they're running this on less than 10 volts, then like the RDS on just gets higher, and that is just going to make this VRM even worse. So I'm assuming they're running it off of 10 volts, because if they're not, or 12 volts, quite possibly 12 volts, because actually generating a 10 volt rail would require a voltage regulator, and most motherboard vendors is just like, now we'll just run it off a straight 12, which is fine. Like, you can do that, the MOSFETs will survive it. But 10 volts or higher, because otherwise the RDS on is going to just be awful. It's just there's no benefit to driving them with more than 10 volts, because the RDS on sort of flatlines around 10 volts. So 10 volts drive, 300 kilohertz switching frequency. This thing will produce, for 1.42 volts, 75 amps output, about 10.3 watts of heat on the MOSFETs themselves. That's not bad, until you consider that the MSI motherboard, which, as I mentioned, had a low side MOSFET with a 2.8 milliohm RDS on, also slightly better high side MOSFET, that produces, for that same rating, the MSI board was 8.5 watts. So the MSI board's slightly more efficient, and that's, again, for 300 kilohertz. The MSI board does, admittedly, under load, run at a higher switching frequency. It goes all the way up to 450 kilohertz, which basically just means that the MSI board should have a voltage regulation advantage, because the higher your switching frequency, the lower your voltage, your ripple voltage on the output of the VRM is, and also the faster your transient response. So yeah, so for 300 kilohertz, the MSI is more efficient, and at 450 kilohertz, the MSI might be the same efficiency, but significantly better voltage regulation, so not a win there. Now, 1.42 volts again, and so this would be like a first gen 6 core or an APU, or like, this is pretty low, and also the voltage is a bit high, but basically that's 75 amps output. That's like a CPU running stock, or one of the lower core counts, or the first gen 6 cores. Now, 1.42 volts, that would be 100 amps, which is around what a second gen 6 core at 1.42 volts will pull, or a, well, not at that voltage, or a 1700, like 1800X at 1.42 volts will pull that, or a stock 2700X on all-core, well, not completely stock, I don't think. Yeah, actually, yeah, stock. A stock 2700X at full, like, all-core load on a high-end motherboard will actually push around 100 amps, because it does go and completely violate its own TDP. So for that 100 amps output, for this board, you're looking at around 16 watts of heat output. For the MSI, you would have been looking at about 12.5, which is just like that's awful. Like, that's the massive advantage for the MSI board. Now, 1.42 volts, 125 amps. So this is like a 2700X AVX workload, 4.15 to sort of 4.2 gigahertz, maybe even 4.3. I like the 4.3 gigahertz chips. I don't think they would do it for like all the claimed 4.3 gigahertz chips. I don't really believe that they were tested with like Prime 95 or anything, because like I can't even get close to that frequency. So with mine on all cores at the same time. Now, 1.42 volts, 125 amps, which, that's like a 2700X being absolutely hammered. 22 watts, 22.5 watts of heat on this lovely VRM right here. It's like the heatsink might be able to handle that, but for comparison, the MSI board does 18 watts at the same, you know, on the same current rating at a lower at the 300 kilohertz. At 450 kilohertz, it would actually be less efficient. It would probably be around the same efficiency. I've not redone the calculations, so really, this I like. It is admittedly like you're gonna have you're gonna have 3/4 of that heat on this part of the VRM, and then 1 bit of it there. But I just feel like this is a lot of heat, and I'm not sure if this heatsink will actually be able to deal with, like, these two heatsinks will be able to deal with that. Though, to be completely honest, these are probably the most like as far as surface area and mass goes, these heatsinks do seem to be the largest out of all the boards I've gone through so far. Not like at this price level or like lower end-ish boards. Heatsink wise, these are pretty solid heatsinks. But that's a lot of heat. And there's an I/O cover over them, so the airflow behind the heatsinks is going to just be awful. The other thing is, it's just like Gigabyte has all this empty space down here. I would have thought, like, I get that it would screw up like, they have a bunch of traces running through there for the I/O section, but if you just, spread all these MOSFETs out, I'd be it would help their thermals quite significantly. So, yeah, this is by far probably the least efficient well, no, definitely the least efficient VRM on X470. No, there's the Asus Tough board. I forgot about that thing. There's the Asus Tough board. But of the boards you should actually kind of of the boards that I've done, this is so far the least efficient VRM. So yeah, we'll see if the heatsinks can make up for that, but I'm kind of skeptical. Like, actually really skeptical if the heatsinks will be able to make up for that. Now then, SOC VRM. So the SOC VRM, again, assuming 10 volts drive and 300 kilohertz, 1.2 volts, 20 amps, which is around what you'll see on like a typical Ryzen CPU if you're pushing 1.2 volts, which is a tad high. Honestly, you should probably stay around 1.15, but it makes the VRM efficiency worse if you push more voltage. So for 1.2 volts, 20 amps, you're going to be looking at about 2.35 watts of heat, which is actually very similar to what the MSI gets on its 2-phase. And I actually rather like that this is a 3-phase SOC VRM. Like, I think we'll get to the efficiency situation, but the phase count makes me hopeful that this board would be slightly better at, say, iGPU overclocking than some of the other boards, because a lot of the other X470 boards are just 2-phase SOC VRM, and I do wonder if this might not have an advantage at iGPU overclocking because of the slightly higher phase count. So, anyway, moving on. 1.2 volts, 30 amps. You're going to be looking at about reading the wrong set of notes, 4.2 watts of heat, which is about 1.2 watts worse than what the MSI board gets. Then 1.25 volts, 40 amps, which this is like, these are like APU results. 1.25 volts, 40 amps. You're going to be looking at about 6.5 watts of heat, which is about 2 watts worse than the MSI board. And then for 1.3 volts, 50 amps, you're going to be looking at about 9.35 watts of heat, which is about 3 watts worse than the MSI board. So this 3-phase, while it is a 3-phase, is less efficient because these MOSFETs are again, they're using the same high side and low side MOSFETs. So 4C06 low side, 4C10N high side. I like the phase count. Like, honestly, I really want to test if this has a SOC, like, decent iGPU overclocking capabilities, because the higher phase count would hopefully help in that department. But as far as the MOSFETs and the efficiency are concerned, they're off. Like, they're just bad. So, yeah. But the SOC heatsink, I think, if you need to, you might be worth removing the sticker. I don't know. We'll have to see. But yeah, basically, this board, the VRM on here is not efficient because it's literally the same VRM they had for X370. So they've made zero progress as far as the actual MOSFETs go. They have upgraded the heat sinks. We'll see how much that helps, but I am really, like, pretty disappointed that this is, well, for the ultra gaming, I kind of understand it, like I can get that. But the problem is they now have the Gaming 5, and last time the Gaming 5 had the same VRM as the Gaming K7. And this time around, the Gaming 5 is on this VRM, and this VRM is just low end, you know, bad. Low end, bad, and it's just, yeah, if you're considering the ultra gaming, well, no, if you're considering the Gaming 5, you should also consider if you want the Ultra Gaming, because they're basically the same motherboard as far as overclocking goes, because they both use the same voltage controller, the same MOSFETs, the same inductors, like, you know, they're basically the same board as far as I'm concerned. Because I think the only thing the Gaming 5 does is it adds a bunch of RGB, which, you know, it's like that doesn't actually impact the quality of the motherboard at all. It's just like you can make a garbage motherboard and still tack on a ton of RGB. Now then, one thing that is maybe a positive is that Gigabyte is actually using the capacitors that they have everywhere are your, like, the usual, where can we zoom in on one? These. So they use them everywhere, and they're FP5K Nichicons. So that's a Japanese capacitor. It's a solid polymer capacitor. And they're rated for 5,000 hours at 105 degrees Celsius. So these are solid capacitors. Like, literally. They're very literally solid capacitors. But they had that on the previous boards. And it's not really like this isn't a special feature in my opinion, because a lot of boards use this type of capacitor from Nichicon. So it's just like, you know, I don't see this as a huge positive for this motherboard, because there's a lot of boards with the same kind of capacitor out there. So, yeah, that's the VCore VRM. The memory VRM, we're not going to go into detail too much. Like, we're not going to go over the efficiency, but you get a high side and two low sides, and all of those MOSFETs are 4C06s, which is fine. The DDR4 doesn't pull enough power for me to even care about this VRM, because every time I've gone over this VRM, it's a single phase or a two phase, and it's like 1 or 2 watts of heat output, pretty much regardless of which motherboard you look at. So I've calculated this before. It's somewhere between 1 and 2 watts for 4 sticks at 1.5 volts. So yeah, that's fine. I'm not going to complain about that, because like you even get high-end boards with this kind of VRM, and it's just like, it's fine. It might not be the most efficient, but it's definitely not going to overheat. So, yeah, that's the board. That's the Ultra Gaming. I really don't think this board deserves to have the word Ultra on it. Like, there's nothing on this motherboard that I would even remotely consider Ultra. So, also, it's just confusing with Gigabyte's naming scheme, because, like, Ultra Gaming, in my opinion at least, sounds like it should be above a Gaming 5, right? Like, that just kind of makes sense, that Ultra Gaming would be above Gaming 5, because Ultra is, like, above a number. But, anyway, that's the X470 gaming board from Gigabyte, as well as the Gaming 5, because, same VRM on both. So, yeah, I'm really not impressed with the VRM here. Mostly because it's the same one they used last time, and the 2700X pulls more power than the 1800X. So, yeah, it will be interesting to see how this motherboard does. Also, I think that means that the board, since they're using the same voltage controller as last time, they probably won't have LLC settings. Which is funny, because this voltage controller very specifically supports LLC settings, but I think it's basically Gigabyte thing, because if you don't change the droop on the VRM, at the stock droop, you won't actually be able to hit 1.42 volts until you set the VCore, like, ridiculously high. And basically, it's a safety system to make sure that, like, you can't burn out the motherboard, because you literally can't set the voltage high enough to get 1.42 volts. So you won't hit that 125 amps. But yeah, that's just bad. Because like the MSI board, which costs basically the same, if not less. I actually think the MSI board is less. That has a better VRM, has LLC settings, and it's just like, the heatsink is, it might have a worse heatsink, but it has a slightly more efficient VRM, so, you know, that this is just, well, we'll see. But as far as the PCB goes, I am really not impressed. And I'm pretty sure it'll end up that after I test this board, it'll just be like, go buy the Gaming Plus, because it's just better than this thing. So, yeah. That's it. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment or any questions down below. Also, thanks to the patrons for funding the purchase of this motherboard. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, then I have a Patreon, a PayPal, there's t-shirts, there's a link to all of that down in the description below. And it would really help out because, like, as I said, like, the only reason I have this board for testing is because of the patrons. I think there's a good reason for that, because if Gigabyte sent me this board, well, I don't think they'd ever send me anything again after this video, so yeah. That's kind of it. Thanks for watching, and see you all next time.